Hi, my name is Daniel, I really love movies, and today I'm going to rank the entire Paranormal Activity franchise, from the worst to the best. So, I came around to these movies in a pretty funny way actually. I started that first one several times before suddenly it stuck. I watched the other ones and come to find that I honestly slept on this franchise. It just tells such a continuous and compelling story for me. I genuinely have a lot of fondness for this series in a way that, considering my initial thoughts to it, surprises me. I'd say my biggest pullback from watching these originally, the fact that I wasn't really into ghost or paranormal movies, let alone didn't really have the biggest interest in found footage either. I watched these largely due to my sister. See, me and her had very different tastes in horror movies. I had the better one, obviously, but if you're watching, no shade, especially since after hyping these up for so long, or the first two anyway, I'd be the first one to not only finish the franchise, but to then strongly encourage her to watch the other ones. And we literally got in trouble for watching them at my grandparents' house. It was so dramatic, but hey, we were invested. All that being said, how did I end up ranking them? Well, this is just my opinion, I'd love to hear yours, but without further ado, here's my ranking. In last place is going to be Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension. This movie is a big example of what I like to call a Trojan horse. What was teased as this, at the time, big finale for this franchise ended up being a pretty disappointing, if not completely underwhelming, or even half-baked one. It was even more disappointing when, I think, the previous movie set such a high bar that they doubled down on quite a lot. And the thing was, they actually had some pretty good ideas here. Having a camera that can pick up supernatural energies, not the ghosts, was the boldest idea, especially for this series. But it literally just ends up being, for the sake of making this one, 3D. This time around rewatching it, yes, I did watch it in 3D because, like I said before, I am a sucker for 3D movies. While I'll admit it was at least somewhat decent or even trippy, it's an example of a 3D franchise film where we lose most of the plot and, by extension, some of the appeal of the series too. To me, and I'm sure everyone else, what makes these movies work so well is what we don't see. And the 3D gimmick not only diminishes that, but also, even for the highest budget, adds this out-of-place, almost cartoony feel. Another thing that makes these movies work so well is the characters, and how they react to what's going on around them. And here, the new characters we're following are not only underdeveloped, but are just a copy and paste of a family that moves into a haunted house from one of those generic paranormal movies that I referred or at least alluded to not liking. Because, also from those movies, do we have the creepy little girl with the imaginary ghost friend trope, topped off with an insane and repetitive amount of empty jump scares. All that being said, with how much that went into this movie, it's like they forgot that this was also, like they teased, the final film. They do give us, I want to say, one or two answers, but they're extremely underwhelming and still leave us wanting more. Again, it's almost as if the real plan was that someone wanted to make a 3D haunted house found footage film that just happened to have Paranormal Activity slapped onto it. But in sixth place is going to be Paranormal Activity: Next of Kin. I finally watched this one for the first time just for this video. I avoided this one for so long because the last one was not only both the nail and the coffin for me, but also because I had heard this was something completely different that had little to no connection at all to the others. And most importantly, the fact that it went straight to streaming. While it gets many points down for that, I was at least optimistic because we had Christopher Landon, who wrote parts 2 to 4, as well as and directed part 5, back as the writer. Because clearly, forgot to mention, he was not involved with 6 and it showed. Anyway, while his touch is certainly back, mostly in the characters, which are, no pun intended, a lot more dimensional than the ones in Ghost Dimension, this story still ended up being pretty underwhelming. Speaking of Ghost Dimension, I went pretty back and forth on where to place these two, to be honest, because, like Ghost Dimension, this was probably a story that they also decided to throw Paranormal Activity on, except this time much more far removed in a way that didn't entirely work for me. Also like Ghost Dimension, Where that one was and mostly focused on 3D, this one goes for a more polished look. I mean, on one hand, it goes with the documentary vibe, but on the other, it just feels like an excuse to show off camera effects, the same way that Ghost Dimension wanted to show off 3D effects. One major aspect that practically ruins it though, is the fact that they literally add a musical score to this. Not once, but a few times actually, that definitely took away from that realism I was missing from the other ones. Anyways, all the negative aside, I will say that some of the story wasn't the best, but not all that half bad. The Amish setting, for one, was a pretty welcome change, even though I feel like they could have done more with it, and of course, made more of a connection to the other movies. Still, I never really got bored, there was plenty of energy, and I was genuinely on my toes here and there. But I don't think I'd be in any immediate rush to rewatch this one. This is definitely not the worst, but still a streaming movie. In 5th place is going to be the original Paranormal Activity. So, I know I said it took me forever to watch this movie all the way through, and that may have sounded negative, but trust me, I don't hate this movie, and from this point, none of the others going forward. I wasn't exactly following these movies when they first came out, but I watched this one for the first time, oddly, when YouTube started to become a much bigger platform, just very shy of the post-Vine era. How does that connect? Before there were those cheap, gimmicky, you're obviously making it up, videos where people would claim to see ghosts, report these hauntings or whatever, there was this movie. Again, I wasn't really around to see all of that, but looking where we ended up in that regard, and watching this first movie is absolutely admirable to me. Plain and simple, it came down to these two very unknown actors, Katie Featherston and Mika Sloat, being able to sell it. It's very impressive to me, to be honest, considering that, just in case you didn't know, they were not given a script and very much had to do a lot of improvising. Not only do they bounce off each other so well, even in their initial audition, which again, they completely improvised, they're also just completely believable. I'm telling you, those very first few times watching it were all about warming up to that low-budget found footage feel. Because once I gave them my all, these actors were really able to pull me in. But why is this one so low? Nothing against its impact, but in speaking of the ones I strongly like, it does have the most slow burn and leans more into those haunted house elements I'm not the biggest fan of. Still, it's a worthy introduction to what, I think, becomes a much grander story. In 4th place is going to be Paranormal Activity 2. I don't have that much to say about this one, to be honest, which almost came lower, as it does have that same family being haunted setup in horror that, again, I'm especially not a fan of. But at the same time, they do feel kind of different from those typical families, in that they have very unique reactions and even have a little fun with what's going on around them. Christy and Daniel, yes, my name too, are nowhere near as captivating as Katie and Mika are in the first movie, but with how they end up connecting to what happened in that first movie, gives them their own interesting edge. And how that leads to what happens at the end of this one, effectively sets up a darker tone for the sequels to come. This one in general was much darker, had plenty of those fun type of scares, especially watching with family, and certainly piqued my interest in this series a whole lot more. In 3rd place is going to be the 3rd Paranormal Activity, the one that finally explored Katie and Christy's childhood, which was interesting but kind of disappointing in some regards. Referring back to the first two movies, there was this big emphasis on this tragic house fire that occurred during their childhood that we don't get to see at all. Oddly, mostly for the trailer and apparently somewhere in the end. However, it's not the biggest gripe, as there is a lot more good in this movie that brings it up quite a lot for me. This is the one where the more straightforward horror elements I like come in. There are plenty of fun set pieces that happen almost from left to right in this one, as opposed to the more slow burn of the first two movies. There's the babysitter scene, many of the bedroom scenes, and probably my favorite, the Bloody Mary scene. As good as all that sounds though, this is where things started to become a little more repetitive. That is until the finale, which, compared to the first two movies, was the biggest change of pace. Where the first two had more abrupt endings, this is the first of the rest to to have this thrilling, edge-of-your-seat chase scene type of ending. The grandma's house, where this happens of course, especially, was the perfect setting for this type of scenario. But speaking of the grandma, Lois, I feel like in the times this was feeling more formulaic, we could have spent more time with her. With how much of a key player she turns out to be especially, it would have been much more interesting. At the same time though, I guess it all worked out, as regardless, we do finally start to get more out of the interesting and deeper mythology of the series in this one. In second place is going to be Paranormal Activity 4. I see this one get a whole lot of hate, but I find this one to be the most comforting actually. It's certainly, by Paranormal Activity standards anyways, the lightest of these. And of course, by my standards, the fun Disney Channel style entry of the series. The vibe here was, and so many comparisons can be made, hear me out. Good luck, Charlie. I know, I can be completely random, but anyway, the reason I love this one so much is because it's the first to really put the younger perspective at the center. It wasn't necessarily relatable, but something I just vibed a lot more with, as opposed to the older, more authoritative perspective of the earlier entries. The two actors here especially, Catherine Newton, who's been in a lot of horror movies ever since, and Matt Shively, who's done a lot of Disney Channel work, both have strong screen presences, bounce off each other so well, and give this one so much energy. I also love how dated this movie is. We got early references to duck lips, and of course, the Xbox Kinect, which I want to say this movie did a whole lot more with than we did as a collective. While, yes, nothing really major happens, and it ends up being quite unnecessary in the grand scheme of things, I still think of this one as that fun middle-of-the-road entry that always gets me excited and in the mood for the next one. And speaking of, in first place is going to be Paranormal Activity, the marked ones. If you didn't already gather, yeah, I ranked these first 5 movies in chronological order as, in my humble opinion, these movies just got better and better as they went. I genuinely enjoyed all of them quite the same, to be honest. Not in a some are way better than others type of way, but like I said, or at least implied with the first one, a part of a bigger story type of way. A big story that, I think, came to this massive culmination in this one. Not only was the Latino perspective a much needed and welcome change of pace, it was also, perhaps, one of the more realistic. Moreover, it's a perspective that I can personally resonate with, as, surprise fact about me, I am half Latino. I know I don't look it, but I am very much familiar and have been around a lot of the aspects of the culture they explore in this movie. Further, it's these characters that we follow who feel the most authentic and are the strongest out of the series. All that, and this is exactly why the stakes never felt higher. This was honestly the scariest out of the franchise as well. I'm a pretty desensitized horror fan too, and I had to turn the lights on for a second after I first watched this. This was Paranormal Activity at its peak. If only we had seen more like this, to be honest, and the next movie gave us the answers that, to this day, we still need. And that was my ranking of the entire Paranormal Activity franchise. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want, you can check out my other rankings in a playlist link below. Up next, I'll be ranking the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. Until then, like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, keep loving movies.